Yes.
Is there some way to beam them up, or
Yeah. Yes.
shall I go and stand over there? I don't know.
No.
Well, thank you. By the way, for that, so my name is Tony Wilson from the Centre for Economic and Social Inclusion, and Anne had asked me to talk about sort of 20-year potted short history of welfare reform in the UK, but actually specifically to talk about welfare to work, employment support, benefit conditions, and so on. But I will touch on many of the same themes around. I'm already very happy to. I'll touch on some of them as I go. But very happy to a discussion. Same themes around generosity and eligibility and attitudes to the benefit system more generally, because that's clearly. That's an area we've done a lot of work on. It's clearly quite relevant to this discussion as well. Is there any?
No. The answer to that is no. So someone has to operate. Yes.
If you like, it's up to you. You probably know what I'm going to say.
Yeah,
that's absolutely fine.
Sure. Okay. So first point I was going to make really was that trying to do a 20-year history of welfare to work is hard because, or of benefit conditions is hard because this is a kind of 100-year, go for it, really a 100-year story. I think best exemplified in Beveridge report in 1942, William Beveridge being one of the key architects of the welfare state in the UK, the author of the sort of defining piece in 1942 that led to the subsequent creation of the welfare state. Somebody who's claimed by politicians on the left and the right as being exactly the person we had in mind. Yeah, we're exactly with Beveridge actually. You can always find a Beveridge quote who's a sort of Marmite character really, he wrote all sorts of reports about all sorts of things with the Commission and not of the government. So you can always find a Beveridge quote about that point. But this one is pertinent because this idea of requiring people to participate in work-related activity as a condition of receiving unemployment benefit has existed for as long as we've had unemployment insurance, unemployment benefits, and indeed right back into the 19th century and further back than that. Another sort of really good, even better quote, I think, was from Nick Timmins' book, The Five Giants, which is essential reading, really, if you're interested in, if you're a geek about welfare states. The Jarrow Marchers achieved very little at that time, and indeed when many of them came back from Jarrow, they came back to find that their benefits had been cut because the Unemployment Assistance Board said, well, if you're marching to London, how can you possibly be looking for work? So these issues have always existed. We've always placed these requirements and conditions on the unemployed. I think where there's real problems, I think, in how we understand why we're doing that, whether it works and what the right balance is between conditions and support. And I think, just in terms of sort of defining the problem, what we're going to talk about briefly really is threefold. It's around the conditions we attach to benefit receipt, particularly, I think it's important here to distinguish between the conditions, the requirements to be available for and to look for work as a condition of being unemployed. That is being claiming a benefit that by definition is benefits paid as part of being unemployed and able to work and to look for work. And the conditions that are attached to people who claim other benefits and where they're not reasonably expected to return to work or to be able to work. The benefit conditions are 1 point, employment support critically is the second, whereas the third actually on my side here. And the third point then is the sanctions regime essentially that sits alongside, that sits behind those conditions that are attached to benefit. I'll talk about each of those in turn. On conditions, why do we have conditions? Well, the arguments generally are economic and political, clearly. It's a belief that, and you can argue, I think, there's a legitimate argument about whether these are economic arguments or fiscal arguments. There's clearly a fiscal case for conditions because it reduces benefit rolls. People in the Treasury and in finance departments like making benefits conditional. They often don't like looking at the subsequent costs when things go wrong, the costs on other services, the costs on society and on families. It's clear political arguments. This is, as I say, sort of known characteristic of welfare states for a century or more. think there are also equity arguments, though, probably more, which I think is might be more controversial, but a good example of this, which I'll come back to, is around taxation for people aged over 50 under the previous government, where essentially the introduction of what's called the intensive activity period, which was essentially a requirement to attend to job centres more frequently, somebody aged over 50, was evaluated to have had a really, really significant impact, 25% impact, percentage point impact on the likelihood of those people finding work. And that was simply because job centre advisors were not supporting over 50s. And over 50s were allowed to drift away from the labour market through periods of unemployment. And that process of activation and conditions and engagement was important in increasing employment for that group and bringing people into greater employment support. So I think there are arguments for social arguments as well as fiscal ones. But clearly there are significant risks which are set out on the slides, not least risks around people's lack of understanding of the system and the system not being applied appropriately, and people making wrong choices. As we've heard, very much the same issues exist here, as we all know, around growth in low-paid employment, growth in insecure temporary work, and generally lower take-up of education and training opportunities amongst people who are out of work because they're not entitled to it, in addition to their benefits, because they're simply not given access to that support through the support they receive through Job Centre Plus. So there are clear sort of issues and risks. On the positive history, as it were, the last 20 years, as Anne says, this starts, the key moment I think was 1986 in Restart, when the decision was made to switch back on essentially the active, the requirements of long-term unemployed people to attend job centres, to attend employment services. And actually the system has been a lot tougher, a lot more conditional in the past. In the 1960s, twice weekly signing was the norm. It's fluctuated sort of up and down over the years, how often you need to attend job centres, what you need to do when you're there. 1970s was largely dialed down, and indeed in the 80s actually Thatcher switched it off pretty much completely in 1983. But that process really began in 86, but the key moments I think were the introduction of job seekers allowance in 1996, which immediately led to a huge reduction in the number of people on benefit rolls as conditions were tightened up, eligibility was tightened, and benefit checks were made much tougher. And we've lived with that for 20 years now, 30 years now. 20 years ago, thanks for that saying, slightly wrong. But then more recently in that, kind of the introduction of conditional, of what probably more recognised in the international literature can be called sort of service and sanction models, but the idea of conditional benefit, conditional support, essentially employment support. The key moments being the introduction of the new deals, first in 1999 for young people, then in the early 2000s for older people. Brought together, essentially with the creation of Job Centre Plus, a massive public sector rebranding exercise, lurid green and purple offices, but also environments at that time that were much more welcoming to people, with advisors who were very highly motivated, many of who were very good at their jobs at supporting people, and still are actually supporting people into work. But we've seen over the last decade or so, particularly over the last 5 years, real issues in the delivery of that support in the services that Job Centre Plus is offering, in the role that it's playing. And that process of activation over the last decade has extended beyond employment support for people who are unemployed and into increasing testing of approaches for people who are not looking for work, paying benefits because they're caring for children, or because they have a health condition or a disability that limits their ability to work. And this, I think, has been hugely problematic, particularly the extension of conditionality for people with health conditions on incapacity benefit, employment support allowance. So I'll come back to that. For lone parents, single parents, it's a slightly different story, actually, interestingly. But again, we'll touch on that. And so, the work programme, which Bill, you're going to talk about the work programme more, aren't you? Then I'll talk about it on I'll make some observations about it too at a high level. So the work programme has been very much a continuation of the process of reform with the New Deals first, the introduction of flexible New Deal, which attempted to introduce a greater focus on employment outcomes and to reduce some of the prescription around how support was delivered and the requirements to deliver certain types of support rather than to personalise that support to individuals' needs. The work programme is very much an extension of that approach. Its failures, I think, are largely a consequence of poor design and I would say probably accidents and bungling and mistakes rather than necessarily a grand plan to, as I've shown, to reduce funding and support for the most disadvantaged. So has it worked? I think there is strong evidence that conditionality for job seekers in the UK, in many other countries, and there's a stack of OECD evidence as well, is very effective at reducing the number of people who claim benefits. Come on to talk about employment in a moment. It has also been, as I say, effective for some marginalised groups. It is more effective than for others. And low parent recommendations is a good example of this, where the move to require lone parents with older children to claim job seekers allowance rather than income support, and thus to be required to attend job centres and engage in employment support, has led to positive impacts. And positive impacts both on employment and reductions in benefit receipt. I think there are wider issues here actually about well-being, which I think we've evaluated very well, about the trade-offs that people have to make as a consequence of that boom in pure sort of economic fiscal terms. Job seeking conditionality appears to have worked fairly well at achieving its objectives. There's actually pretty strong evidence as well, very strong evidence on the New Deal for young people, which is this graph here, which shows essentially the likelihood of people leaving job seekers allowance declines over time, which is what you'd expect. And then the point where they enter the New Deal programme, it increases significantly. Now, the New Deal has had its critics. But very few, if any, critics would say that it was a programme, when it was working well, that was actively pushing people off benefits and into any job. The gateway process was essentially really intensive advisor support, running for 3 months, and very personalised help to build skills and capabilities, build confidence, improve job search, etc. Generally, this continues to be held up as an exemplar of best practice. And it's sort of worth, I think, although we've been very critical of the UK approach, it is still held up by the OECD as kind of the exemplar model for how you deliver conditional support for unemployed people. And this was from its job strategy or its employment outcome in 2014. So only last year. I think it's getting a bit tired now. We have Jobs Into Plus. I think it's changed somewhat from the organisation that was created a decade ago. But nonetheless, it's still held up as really sort of best practice in how we improve, how we bring together benefits and employment support, and has been the model for reforms in many other European countries as well. But as we said, most of the evidence says that conditional support for unemployed people is effective in reducing the amount of having benefit. The evidence far more makes that impact on employment. The evidence on the introduction of JAGS 8 suggests that it may not have had much of any positive impact on employment. Jobs Into Plus evidence is slightly different. But there's a whole sort of range of issues around what the evidence is telling us, but we certainly know that they appear to be less effectively increasing employment than reducing benefit receipt. And critically, I think, there's basically no evidence that conditionality, particularly for people who claim health-related benefits, has had any positive impact at all. And that's with more than a decade now of testing approaches and trying different things through work-focused interviews, through mandatory participation in employment support, through requirements to attend work centres and often even verge on requirements to engage in treatment, in support to manage a condition. These programs have all been pretty comprehensively now evaluated to have had no overall impact on the likelihood of people being able to find work. And that's been a huge headache and challenge for policymakers. It will continue to be, and it's a sort of great public policy failure that we still don't know after more than 2 decades of reform, how to most effectively support people who make the vast majority of people who are claiming out work benefits, who have health conditions that limit their ability to work. And it's worth saying as well that wider debates about conditionality to be a good tenant when you're renting, conditionality to improve your skills if you're at work, conditions of venture, conditions to engage in drug treatment if you're a drug user, to lose weight if you're overweight, etc. Every time these things have been tried, again, they've been shown to be not only unworkable but also entirely ineffective. So many challenges. And on employment support, you have to keep pressing this. Go on for ages. We have tried a lot of things over the years. I think the UK system has been characterised by a real sort of fuzzy sense of purpose and direction and objectives that's led us to testing any number of different programmes, different groups, different ways, different contexts, and often with really poor quality evaluation of their impacts. But nonetheless, it does mean that there's very few new ideas. We've tried a lot. We've actually, over that period, even made very few good quality impact assessments, cost benefit analyses as well. Programs, we do have a fairly good idea of the sorts of support that are more effective at engaging people, helping people find work, reaching employers, and so on. And that's kind of culminated now in the work programme, which I think Bill will talk about some more. I mean, our take on it has been that it's probably working fairly well if you're unemployed, if you're relatively easy to help. The work programme is a mandatory programme. Anyone who's unemployed or claiming unemployment benefits for more than a year is required to take part. It's a 2-year programme. And many people, not the majority, but many people who claim health-related benefits are required to enter as well, again, for 2 years. It's heavily outcome-based, so essentially now providers only get paid, it's privatised, providers only get paid for achieving employment outcomes, so payment by results essentially. And this shows the proportion of claimants who find sustained employment, which is defined as employment that lasts for 3 or 6 months. And the top 2 bars are job seekers, so people who are unemployed. And the third of young job seekers find sustained employment, over a quarter of job seekers find sustained employment. We haven't yet had a kind of net impact assessment of that. It will come out. We think the benchmarking we've done with previous programs, where we do have pretty good data, suggests that this is creating additional employment impacts of those groups. Probably not huge, but they're certainly comparatively probably better now than previous programs. However, for people who claim health-related benefits, employment support allowance, the figures are pretty dire, well below what government and what the providers of the programme have said that they would achieve. It's, again, another programme that's failed to support those with more complex needs. And also, big issues around selection biases, essentially, supporting those who are closer to work and parking those who are further from work. This is the difference from the average. This is the stats that came out, or basically the stats that came out yesterday. Difference from the average for disadvantaged groups. So disabled people are 10% less likely to find employment. Older people are similarly 10% less likely. So that group where I was saying that actually activation and conditions of work for older people in the work programme, see what happens, I think, when you switch that off. So most worrying though, this is, I think, it is actually a great concern to people in government, including to ministers actually, I think, is that the work programme has managed to significantly reduce financial support, reduce funding for employment support for people at a time when actually it was intended to, when it was designed to increase support. And that's been for a whole range of reasons, but fundamentally, if you have a payment by results system, you don't get the results, then you don't get the payments. And we've seen essentially a performance equilibrium for disadvantaged groups has meant that we're now significantly underfunding support for people with health conditions. I think the funding around £600 per participant for 2 years of support, when the design intention was to be funding around £1,000 per participant. And that's purely because we got the sums wrong at the start around what level of performance we achieved, and that's meant that the results didn't come through, payments didn't come through, and then we're stuck in a program that cuts funding and reduces support. Now, I think also workfare, I'm not going to talk a huge amount about, but the key thing I would say is that essentially, beyond that headline of the work programme, actually, for all the bluff and bluster that we hear in the news about compulsory workfare and work activity for young people and various other things, the government has actually done really very little beyond fairly small scale trials and small programmes. We've seen a ramping up of sanctions, which have been set, but we haven't actually seen a massive extension yet of workfare. A lot of politicians, particularly the Prime Minister, talks about it, it's not followed through yet. And all the evidence on workfare is awful. I mean, not only does it have very little positive impact, it is often some quite negative impacts by taking people away from the work, being paid for the work. So, I think just a couple of sort of slightly obscure points. While everyone's been focused on a different story about welfare reform, about cutting benefit entitlements and reforming the welfare system and increasing sanctions and everything else, the government has rather taken the entire ball of overall expenditure on employment support allowance. There are two sort of key things here. This is what the government said it would spend on employment support allowance in 2010, which was £10 billion a year. This is what the government now thinks it is going to spend on employment support allowance in the budget documents that were released this week, which is £15 billion per year. And that is because ATOS failed in their contract on delivering WCA. The government has made various changes to WCA. Got to the point now where for many people they switch off, they're no longer doing face-to-face assessments for WCA, which means that the work capability assessment, the entry criteria to enter this health benefit employment support allowance. Most people, if you don't get a face-to-face assessment, you're far more likely to be found entitled to the ESA, and you can then only go into a support group which pays a higher rate of benefit to work-based activity group. There's a whole range of administrative reasons now leading to a £5 billion a year overspend on the government's plans on employment support allowance. And you don't hear that talked about when the government says it's saving less than £1 billion, £200 million a year on benefit cap, or £300 million a year on the size criteria of the benefit tax. So where are we? Tight job seeking conditions, but actually I would argue by historic standards, the conditions attached to JSA aren't actually aren't significantly tighter than they have been in the past. There's a lot of compliance going on, a lot of checking going on in Job Centre Plus. It's changed its focus away from being a public employment service towards being a compliance and monitoring service. But the underlying conditions are not much changed. We've seen some extension of work there, but not actually much. A real collapse in employment support, but a continued failure for those who are further from work. And I've not even mentioned universal credit, I won't actually, that's a bit of that's another story. And also just to say a word on sanctions, will literally just be a minimum too. We've seen a massive growth in sanctioning over the last 3 years. The numbers are probably, I don't think this is quite the most recent data, this will be for the committee report on for our committee inquiry into sanctions. The numbers are probably dropping back actually, and all the talk to Job Centre Plus, this Job Centre and so on more recently, it does appear that sanctions rates are actually falling somewhat in the last few months. There are real issues in understanding some of the data here, because the data that's published only shows the very final end result. People who definitely have a sanction applied. We know many more people have sanctions applied than subsequently overturned. But nonetheless, the huge growth at the time when sanctions were introduced, the sanctions reforms were made in October 2012, from around 4% of payments per month, job seekers per month being sanctioned to around 7%. And this is huge by historic standards, but we have had kind of peaks in the past. In the mid-2000s, when the job seekers regime was relaunched by John Hutton, we saw sanction rates pretty much double sanctions rates dropped like a stone. Ministers then said, we need to throw back on the freedom and flexibility agenda. Actually, we do want you to apply sanctions and implement it. So one of my points here is don't blame Job Centre Plus and don't blame individuals. They're very good at following the instructions they give. So we've seen a huge growth in sanctions. We've also seen a really significant increase in the penalties of sanctions. So for a first offence, whereas a high-level offence, many are now high-level offences for failing to undertake activity you've been required to take a job seeker's direction, or not being deemed to be available for work, not applying, not taking up a job that you're not good, etc. Then that's essentially loss of benefit, immediate loss of benefit for 3 months. The second offence is loss of benefit for 6 months. The third offence is loss of benefit for 3 years. This is only now starting to play out because it takes time to make multiple offences. But this will grow and grow. So that number, the 3-year sanction number, can only rise, it can only increase over time. And these sanctions rates are high not only by the sanctions penalties are high not only by historic standards, also very high by international standards, as is the fact that we don't have any really hardship regime now. There is access to hardship support, it's quite hard to get, it doesn't pay for the amount, and also that there's virtually no accounting for impacts on families and a whole range of business inputs that affect what you can and can't get hardship. And clearly, this is not a good thing. There's no evidence, despite claiming an OECD report suggests that systems that have high sanctions also have high employment. I mean, it's completely fatuous and wrong. I mean, there is no evidence that sanctions increase, overall increase employment. And I think quite shockingly and shamefully, the government hasn't evaluated its sanctions regimes despite evaluating virtually every other reform it's introduced since 2010. Now, the Patrick was commissioned to do an independent review of this, and although he wasn't asked to look at the impact of sanctions, he nonetheless did make some quite pointed, if not particularly well publicised, comments about people's understanding of the system and the potential impacts of vulnerable groups. A very balanced, I think, very good report, actually. And failures essentially are well understood the sanction system, about understanding the system and negative impacts it can have. And we've seen this now in a range of research, independent government, about its negative impacts, particularly good work being done in Scotland by the Scottish government to try to understand the sanctions impacts, the impacts on emergency support, on food banks, and so on. So I think I should stop there probably. A couple of just very final points then. So, at least 100 years, I think, actually, of sort of conditions and support to varying degrees, for 20 years of good quality evidence. I think there are things, I think we have to be careful not to think that everything is bad in the UK. We do have, in Job Centre Plus, the maintenance of, and certainly in the past, very effective public employment service that I think has gone quite badly wrong in the last couple of years in its ability to support people to look for and find employment. Where we have huge gaps, I think huge risks actually going forward to having the best support those who are furthest from work, where we simply don't know what to do. We're not testing enough, we're not, and we're focusing far too much on the conditions that we attach to benefit rather than the support that we offer. And the sanctions regime is unprecedented, I think, in its impact and its severity. So, pretty, some thoughts, some observations on the UK system. But where do we go next? Over to you. Over to Bill, actually.